Our third major goal of macroeconomics is to have an economy with low inflation. Inflation represents an overall increase in the price level, measured over some combination of goods and services. Now, this point is worth exploring. Inflation doesn't necessarily happen just because the price of gasoline goes up 30 cents a gallon or because a movie ticket costs $1 or $2 more than it did a few years ago. At any given time in a market economy, some prices are going up and other prices are going down. For example, in recent years, the price of a personal computer and a lot of home electronic appliances has been steadily dropping. So in order to measure inflation, inflation has to be defined as a rise in the overall price levels, not just a few prices here and there. How do you measure an overall rise in price level? Well, it's necessary to blend together price changes from many different goods and find some way to calculate a sort of an average. The way this is done is by defining a basket of goods, a basket used in a metaphorical sense here, where the quantity of each good in the basket is chosen to represent typical consumption levels for a household. Then you can say, how would the price of buying that basket of goods, not each individual good, but the overall basket of goods, change over time? This idea of using a basket of goods as a way to measure inflation goes back a long, long time. One of my favorite historical examples, and one of the first, is that in the U.S. Revolutionary War, the state of Massachusetts faced a question of how it would pay its soldiers. The Continental Congress was issuing dollars, but it was hard to say what those dollars were actually worth or what they would actually buy by the time soldiers got home from the war. So, the state of Massachusetts said, we'll pay whatever amount of money would buy the following basket of goods. The basket of goods was 5 bushels of corn, 68 4/7 pounds of beef, 10 pounds of wood, and 16 pounds of leather. And your pay was whatever would buy that group of goods. Now, when we think about the cost of a basket of goods, it's cumbersome and not especially useful always to refer to that cost of the basket of goods by the total dollar amount. And I'll give you an example. Let's say that we added up the typical consumer's basket of goods one year, and it cost $36,287.51. And then next year we added up that same basket of goods, and it cost $37,376.13. Now, unless you are pretty much of a wizard with calculations, it won't be obvious to you that that increase was exactly 3%. So rather than using those dollar figures that can be somewhat complicated, what government statisticians do instead is pick a base year, and they call the spending, what the price level was that year, 100. And then all other years are expressed in relation to that base year. In the previous example, if the base year was 100, then the next year would be 103. With that kind of base year at 100, it's a lot easier to see what changes are pretty much at a glance. And it's also easier to compare across countries or across different measures of inflation at different times. That base year, what year is equal to 100, gets updated sort of every couple of decades. The time these lectures are given, the most common base period is usually the average for the years 1982 to 1984, but I'm sure in a few years they'll update it. And this idea of taking a base period and setting it equal to 100 is what's called an index number, just sort of setting everything proportional to 100. There are a variety of different measures of inflation, depending on what basket of goods is used. The Consumer Price Index, for example, is a very common measure, sometimes called the CPI. The U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics carries out something called the Consumer Expenditure Survey, and that provides detailed information on what people are actually buying, so they can get information on the basket of goods and then set the basket and see what people would buy over time. Another common measure of inflation is called the Producer Price Index. And the difference there is that instead of looking at a basket of goods consumers buy, it would be a basket of goods that producers buy, like stuff that steel and oil and those sorts of things that producers are going to buy instead. There's also something called the Wholesalers Price Index, or WPI, which looks at wholesale prices of things that retailers might buy. And finally, there's something called the GDP deflator. Now, the GDP deflator, the basket of goods, is everything in GDP. And remember, everything in GDP includes not only consumption C, but GDP is C plus I plus G plus X minus M. So consumption plus investment plus government spending plus exports minus imports. Probably the two most common measures of inflation that you'll see are the consumer price index and the GDP deflator. But you can make up a price index for any group. You can make up a basket of goods that shows what the elderly buy, or what the poor buy, or what people in a certain state buy. All you need to do is figure out the representative basket of goods and then figure out what it would cost at different time periods. Now, there's a long-standing concern that the inflation rate, when you calculate the inflation rate using the basket of goods, you might be overstating the true rate of inflation. If the true rate of inflation is the true increase in the cost of living in broad sense. And the real problem here, the real fundamental problem with a fixed basket approach, is that, of course, the basket of goods in the real world doesn't actually stay fixed. People aren't buying identical goods one year and another year. And there are two important ways in which it doesn't stay fixed. Here's the first problem. Imagine that the price of coffee goes way, way up, and coffee is part of the basket of goods. But when the price of coffee goes way, way up, people don't buy the same quantity of coffee. They substitute to tea or hot chocolate or other drinks. So the basket of goods shifts between the two time periods. Now, you're trying to measure inflation, and you say, well, what basket of goods should I use here? Should I use the basket of goods where the quantity of coffee is what it was before the price increased? Should I use a basket of goods representing the quantity of coffee after the price increased? Should I use a basket of goods representing some average of the quantity before and after? The answer is not at all obvious. You can do it any of those ways. But if you just assume that everyone is going to go right on buying just as much coffee as before, regardless of how much the price goes up, you're not taking substitution into account. You're not taking into account that people can shift to things that would give them almost as much pleasure as coffee, and so you're going to be overstating the rise in the cost of living. More generally, how can you have a formula which allows for the fact that there's a constant pattern of shifting demand in the economy, away from goods that are becoming more expensive and toward goods that are becoming relatively less expensive? So that's one big problem with a fixed rate index, or fixed basket of goods. What's the second problem? Second problem is, imagine that, for example, you have phone service in your basket of goods, but then cell phones come into the market. Now, the price of cell phones looks pretty high, but obviously it's a new kind of service, a more flexible kind of service. Then picture phones come on the market. Then portable pocket devices to access the internet and do email and provide other services. Well, if all you're looking at is the price of basic phone service over time, then your basket of goods is not taking these quality improvements and these new goods into account. It's not taking the benefits of improved technology into account. And as a result, you're going to be missing a way in which people are actually doing better in terms of their cost of living, in the sense that they have more options available to them than they did before. So how can we think about these two issues of the problem of substitution within the basket and the problem of new goods and evolution of goods? Well, back in 1996, a prominent group of economists headed by Michael Boskin of Stanford University put out a report on these two biases. And they did their best to sort of look at the evidence on how much substitution between goods occurred, how that substitution would affect the rise in the cost of living, how many new goods are being invented, how that would affect the new cost of living, the true cost of living. And their bottom line, as they looked at this all, was that the true inflation rate was overstated by about 1% a year. In other words, the inflation rate the government was announcing was about 1% higher than the actual increase in the cost of living if you took these other things into account. Now, 1% a year may not seem like much, but actually the implications are huge. Let's say the nominal economy, nominal GDP, grows 5%. And inflation is 3%, so the real growth is 2%. But inflation was overstated by 1%, then real growth was actually 3% a year instead of 2%. And as we know, 1% a year, year after year after year, is going to accumulate over time to have just an enormous impact on how we think of real GDP and changes in the standard of living. Now, there was a fair amount of controversy about the Boskin report and sort of what they were proposing and whether they had things right. But what's happened over time is that the Bureau of Labor Statistics, when they're calculating inflation, now uses statistical methods that allow some substitution between goods when prices go up. So the basket of goods is sort of an average of what was consumed at the beginning and the end of the period. Moreover, they rotate the basket of goods and update it over time. So they're always old goods rotating out and new goods rotating in. So in that way, they can take a lot of the quality adjustments and new goods into account. When the quality adjustments are really, really large, like, say, in computers and information processing, the Bureau of Labor Statistics actually tries to take them into account explicitly, estimate how big the change is, and then plug that right into the formula. So there have been a lot of changes in how inflation is calculated since that Boskin report in 1996. You can certainly make a case that the measure of inflation is overstated, but as you look back at that report, it seems clear that any bias that did exist in 1996 has been substantially reduced in the following decade. It's not, maybe there's still some, but it's not as high as 1%, certainly. What's the historical record with actual U.S. inflation rates? Well, if you go back a long way, say back to 1900, from 1900 up until about 1965, U.S. inflation averaged about 1% a year. However, the inflation rate did have a few periods of extreme fluctuation. In the years right after World War I and right after World War II, the price level, the inflation rate, went way up into double digits for a few years. And the standard reason for that, the standard argument that's given, is that inflation at some fundamental level is when there's a lot of buying power in the economy and not quite enough goods. And so right after war, you've got a whole lot of people coming home. You've got people who've been sort of saving up during the war, and they all want to buy goods all at once. They've got soldiers have back pay and so on, and so you see an increase in the price level. The one converse time was in the Great Depression. There was actually deflation. The average level of prices fell by about 1/3 over the period 1929 to 1933. Now, why did that happen? It would be just the reverse of what happened after war. During the Great Depression, nobody had any money. Banks weren't lending. Banks were all going broke. And the result was that instead of having too much money chasing too few goods, there was hardly any money chasing goods. And so the overall price level dropped and dropped. Well, inflation on average, with the exception of the Depression and the post-war years, had been fairly low up and through the mid-60s. But in the late 1960s, inflation began to climb. In 1971, for example, inflation hit 4.4% in that year. And that was considered in 1971 to be such a dreadfully, awfully, terribly destructive rate of inflation that a conservative Republican president named Richard Nixon imposed national wage and price controls to try and hold down inflation. I still find it just frankly incredible that the U.S. economy tried to impose wage and price controls as recently as the early 1970s. They didn't work any better than you would expect a whole bunch of price floors and ceilings to do. And by 1974, when they pulled off the wage and price controls, inflation kept going up. It was 11% by 1974. It was again in double digits by the late 1970s. In the early 1980s, inflation came way back down, for reasons we'll talk about in later lectures. It was typically in the range of about 2 to 5% during the 1980s. In the 1990s, inflation came down a little bit further, and it was typically maybe 2 to 4% or 1 to 4%. So in recent years, inflation has not been a severe problem, but it's still trickling along there at a rate where you sort of worry that in the early 1970s, we would have sometimes thought it was bad enough to think about wage and price controls. Why is inflation bad? Why are we worrying about it in the first place? This may seem, again, a question that's so obvious only an economist could ever ask it, but bear with me. Let's start off with this thought. Inflation isn't necessarily bad, at least in theory. Imagine that one night, for example, magic money elves came through the entire economy. And the magic money elves sneak into every wallet, every purse, every bank account, every cash drawer, every paycheck, every place where money is. And they double the money everywhere in the economy. What happens the next morning? Well, in the morning, everyone wakes up and they notice that their money is doubled. And everyone says, yippee, and everyone goes out shopping. But, all the storekeepers know what's happened too. And very quickly, they double all the prices on everything. So after the original burst of excitement when everyone wanted to rush out and go shopping, everyone has twice as much money, but all the prices are doubled. No one is better off, no one is worse off, and everybody goes home. The general lesson I'm trying to draw out of this perhaps slightly silly metaphor: if all the prices and wages and interest rates and everything else went up at the same rate of inflation, and that rate was known to everybody, then nobody would care. It wouldn't make any difference to anyone. You could work the same, consume the same, no one is better off, no one is worse off, as long as everything is adjusted. So the problem is that in the real world, inflation is not evenly distributed and is not fully predictable. So it's not going to be adjusted for everyone. Sometimes it'll offer surprising benefits to some groups and costs to others. For example, if you're someone whose pay doesn't rise with inflation and inflation goes up, you're going to fall behind. If you borrowed money to buy a house and you borrowed at a fixed interest rate, say you borrowed at a 5% rate, and inflation goes up to 10%, you come out way ahead. Because when you're repaying that mortgage, you can repay in inflated dollars. You're in effect paying a negative real interest rate. And it's worth remembering, who is the biggest single borrower at a fixed rate in the U.S. economy? It's by far the U.S. government with its large budget deficits in the mid-2000s. And it's worth remembering that inflation, if there was a big burst of inflation, would reduce the real value of all the government debt that's been accumulated. If you borrowed money to buy a house at a fixed rate and the inflation rate falls on the other side, if you borrowed at, say, 6 or 7% and the inflation rate went down to 1 or 2%, then the bank's going to come out ahead and you're going to suffer unless you go ahead and refinance your loan at a lower interest rate. And of course, there are costs to doing that. If for some reason you're the sort of person who holds a lot of cash, maybe buried in a jelly jar in the backyard, or if you're a big retail operation that just gathers a lot of cash in the process of sales, inflation always has you falling somewhat behind. Even relatively low rates of inflation can make a big difference when you're thinking about long-run decisions. Remember, if it's just 1 or 2%, that doesn't seem like much in 1 or 2 years. But if you think about it in terms of the money you're saving for your retirement several decades off in the future, or if you think about it in terms of a firm that's thinking about building a new factory that it hopes will last for a while, over 10 or 20 or 30 years, even low rates of inflation really matter a lot. You need to take them into account. Indexing is the word that economists use to refer to the process of having adjustments automatically made for inflation. For example, if you have an adjustable rate mortgage on your house which goes up and down with the interest rates, the nominal interest rates, those nominal interest rates are going up and down with inflation. And so an adjustable interest rate, an adjustable rate mortgage loan, is really indexed for inflation. The U.S. Treasury issues indexed bonds where the payout of the bond changes automatically with the rate of inflation. Some union contracts specify that the union wages will rise automatically with inflation. This was sometimes called a COLA, or a cost of living adjustment. And Social Security payments have a COLA, a cost of living adjustment. They rise automatically with the Consumer Price Index. Indexing is protection against inflation. If you don't have indexing, you are vulnerable to inflation. And again, indexing means adjusting a price, a wage, or an interest rate automatically for the changes in inflation that might occur. When inflation rates get really high, they can make it difficult for markets to work well because they make it difficult for firms to focus on long-term productivity growth. When inflation gets to the rate of maybe 20% a month, 40% a month, we refer to that as hyperinflation. And hyperinflations have occurred most famously perhaps in Germany in the 1920s, but also in countries like Argentina and Israel and Bolivia in the 1980s. And these countries offer some examples of the costs of letting inflation get just completely out of control. When inflation is high, price signals in the market become unclear. Does a higher price mean something is actually more expensive? Or does it mean that there's just overall inflation? How can you tell a relative price increase from an absolute price increase? Businesses have to spend a lot of time worrying about their vulnerability to inflation. They can't spend their time worrying about productivity. They have to worry about, are we somehow vulnerable? Are we holding a lot of cash? Or how is our money invested in some way that we're going to be suffering because of high inflation? They end up with a very short-term focus, a very financial focus. Let me give you a couple of examples of what's happened in countries with very high inflation rates. Here's an example from a fellow who was working for the Bank of Israel in the 1980s as a deputy governor, and he's describing the problems of inflation at that time in Israel. He said, "Inflation destroys the measuring rod of the economy. When inflation proceeds at, say, 400% annually, yeeks, the average monthly rate is over 14%. A dollar received for sales at the end of the month is worth about 13 cents less than a dollar spent for productive inputs at the beginning of the month." Consumers face problems too. Ordinarily, when people shop, they use a data bank stored in their memory to assess the prices they're asked to pay. But when prices change continuously, people find themselves in the dark. I remember situations during the inflationary years when people could not decide on the reasonableness of prices by up to a factor of 10. I remember when products at the supermarket had 4 price stickers, each with a different price, attached to the product one on top of the other. In the end, the cost of constantly changing the prices became so substantial, retailers abandoned price stickers. Instead, a code sticker was attached to each product, and the cash register was programmed daily to associate prices with codes. Shoppers had no idea of the price of anything they pulled off the shelves until they reached the checkout counter. This makes the task of executing a household budget rather difficult. The government budget process was rendered useless for similar reasons. So that world of high inflation is just extremely difficult to live in. Let me give you another example of Argentina's high inflation in the 1980s. V.S. Naipaul, the wonderful writer, went to Argentina, and here he's quoting a businessman from Argentina about what it was like living in that high rate of inflation. The businessman says, "Another negative aspect of inflation is that you cease to worry about productivity and even technology. Now that is the secret of all progress, productivity. But you really can get no more than 3 or 4% per annum improvement in productivity anywhere in the world. With inflation like ours, you can get 10% in one day if you know when and where to invest. It is much more important to protect your working capital than to think about long-term things like technology and productivity, although you try to do both. This is the inevitable result of inflation, which is the monetary disease. Your money is disintegrating. It's like a cancer. You live day to day. That's all you can do when you have inflation more than 1% a day. You cease to plan. You're just happy to make it to the weekend." So an economy with really high inflation becomes at some level a truly dysfunctional economy. With the U.S. economy, we've never had that kind of hyperinflation, but we did have those high inflation rates in the 1970s. And is it really just a coincidence that the great productivity slowdown of the early 1970s coincided with the great burst of inflation? Or is it just a coincidence that after inflation had been back under control for about a decade, then productivity growth recovered? Prominent economists like John Taylor of Stanford University, who's no relation to me, have argued that there is a connection between these two, and that one of the causes of the U.S. low productivity period was inflation getting out of control. Well, to understand fully the policy tools for fighting inflation, we'll need to wait for the later lectures on fiscal and monetary policy, but we can offer sort of a preview here and a lead-in here. Higher inflation can have many different starting points, but ultimately, inflation is always a matter of too much money chasing too few goods for the economy as a whole. There's consistently too much demand for everything across the board of the economy, and so prices of everything are moving up. You can think of the example of the magical money elves. When there was extra money out there, when they doubled the amount of money out there, then that's what caused everyone to rush out and all the prices to double. So, the policy tools for challenging this situation, changing this situation, all involve holding down the overall level of demand. So there are fewer dollars chasing goods. And none of these policies are especially popular or attractive. One possibility, for example, is raising taxes. Then there would be less money chasing goods. Or cutting government spending. Less money chasing goods. Or using higher interest rates. Higher interest rates would discourage borrowing. Less borrowing would mean less buying houses and cars. And again, there would be less money, less cash, less dollars chasing goods. Now, slowing down the economy in any of those ways, so there's less money chasing goods to fight inflation, is just never going to be a popular thing. When an economy is in hyperinflation, there's often a broad social consensus that the cure for inflation is better than the disease. I mean, when inflation is 400% a year, it's easy to get agreement that it needs to come way down. But is it really worth slowing down the economy, maybe getting higher unemployment, to fight inflation if the inflation rate is 5%, 4%, 3%? There's a big argument around this point between who we might call inflation hawks and inflation doves. The empirical evidence, at least as I read it, on whether or not an economy does a lot better if 5% inflation is cut down to 3% inflation, it just doesn't show an enormous difference. In fact, there are some people out there looking at international evidence around the world who would argue that a lot of economies have been able to function pretty well around the world in the sense of having fairly rapid economic growth with inflation rates that might be as high as 10 or 20 or 30% a year. Now, there's, I think, a fairly broad consensus that once you get above about 40% a year, even the inflation doves would say, well, there's a real problem there you need to work at. What are the arguments here between the inflation hawks and the inflation doves? The inflation hawks, those who really want to chop down inflation extremely low all the time, tend to argue, look, an economy is going to work best if inflation is close to zero. And so whenever you see inflation beginning to take off, you need to nip it in the bud. You need to try and get close to stable prices, the inflation hawks argue, because that's really the only long-term stability. You want people to be making their long-term plans, and maybe more important, businesses to be making their long-term plans about how to get real rates of return, how to increase real productivity, how to see real gains. You don't want people trying to play games with how to make money off of inflation by borrowing and then having a fixed rate and repaying in inflated dollars. You don't want those sort of games in the economy. And so the idea they have is nip inflation in the bud. Fight even low rates of inflation because you don't want anyone to start getting that mindset that inflation is coming. And so I can start playing games or I need to think and focus my attention on inflation. Inflation doves, on the other hand, argue that maybe a little bit of inflation, like 2, 3, 4%, maybe isn't such a terrible thing. Remember, for example, that in the previous lecture we talked about the problem of sticky wages, that wages could get stuck above the equilibrium level, and that employers didn't like to reduce those wages for a variety of reasons, having to do with hurting the morale of employees, more or less. Now, if that's true, what does inflation do? Inflation of maybe 2% or 3% or 4% means that you could give your workers a 2% increase, and really that's no increase at all because inflation eats it up. It's not a real increase. Or if inflation is 4%, you give your workers a 2% increase, and actually there's a little bit of a wage cut. And so the argument is that if there's a little bit of inflation can actually help wages to be less sticky and can help them to come down a little bit. There's also an argument that, well, we don't want to have deflation. We don't want to have price levels actually falling. The big problem with deflation is that when people are trying to repay loans, the value of what they're trying to repay is going up because dollars over time are not becoming less valuable, but are becoming more valuable. And so if we want to avoid deflation and make sure it doesn't happen, maybe we should hold inflation at about 2 or 4%, just to leave us a little margin for error, so we know that we're not going to go down into negative deflation type numbers. The inflation doves would also say that there's no strong evidence that a country with 2, 3, 4, 5% inflation is likely to zoom up to 20 or 30%. And at low rates of inflation, people can protect themselves from that in various ways. So there's no real consensus in this argument, but a common goal seems to be, across many countries of the world, that an inflation rate of about 2% is safe. It helps keep prices low and provides a steady basis for growth, but also doesn't try to push all the way down to zero.